Hello, everyone. My name is Rachael Biscocho, and I'm the president for the Notre Dame Club of New York. I would like to welcome you all to a conversation with Carmelyn P. Malalis, the chair and commissioner of the New York City Commission on Human Rights. This event is co-sponsored by the Asia Pacific alumni of Notre Dame, as well as GALA-ND SMC. As we close out the end of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month and begin Pride Month, we hope to share details on what the New York City Commission on Human Rights is currently doing to address the rise in anti-Asian violence in New York City, as well as the Commission's historical commitment toward the protection of LGBTQIA+ individuals in New York City and the importance of working with allies and advocacy. For this event, we have two familiar faces chatting with Commissioner Malalis, Rona Riodica, our Commissioner on Intercultural Diversity and Inclusion, and Edward Augustine, our Club Vice President. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the event through the link in the description box below. And with that, I pass along the mic to Rona and Edward to introduce Commissioner Malalis.
Well, welcome, and thanks so much, Rachel. I'd like to provide some background from my colleague and friend, Carmelyn Malalis, before we begin. Carmelyn was appointed chair and commissioner of the New York City Commission on Human Rights. We'll be referring to it on and off as the Commission. In November 2014, following more than a decade in private practice as an advocate for employees' rights and workplace, prior to her appointments, Commissioner Malalis was a partner at Alton & Golden. Throughout her career, Carmelyn has demonstrated a fierce commitment to promoting diversity and inclusion and preventing and prosecuting discrimination and intolerance. Since she assumed her role as chair and commissioner in February 2015, Commissioner Malalis has revitalized the agency, making it a recognized venue for justice for all New Yorkers through increased enforcement, novel restorative justice, approaches to case and conflict resolution, and robust public education and outreach to prevent discrimination in New York City. She has served on the New York City Bar Association's Executive Committee and the Committee on LGBT Rights, where I met Carmelyn, and we did great work, and we held really fierce pride parties in June for the Bar Association. Before we head on to the questions, just one other great note is Carmelyn earned her JD from Northeastern University School of Law and received a BA in Women's Studies from Yale University. She and her wife live in New York City with their 2 children. Welcome, Carmelyn Malalis.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think you're on mute, Carmelyn.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much for that, Edward. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you.
It's an honor to have you here, Commissioner Malalis, and I did get permission to call you Carmelyn, so I guess for the rest of the hour, we can call you Carmelyn.
Please do.
I want to echo what Edward said with fierce. I have heard your name throughout the city as a fierce leader in New York City. And as someone who also works for the city of New York at HPD, I hear your name everywhere. So it's truly a great honor to spend this hour with you and get to know you better. So I'd like to kick off with our first question, which is, tell us a little bit about yourself. We definitely want to hear about your personal background, your experiences. You know, you are a very well-known leader and advocate for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community and the LGBTQ community. So we'd really love to hear more about who you are.
Sure, thanks for that, Rona. And again, I just want to thank Notre Dame alum for inviting me for this today, since we're at the very end of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, at the very beginning of LGBTQIA Pride Month. It's like it's an intersection I sit at very comfortably. So very nice to be here for this. So where to start? I'll first start, since Rona, since we are colleagues in government together, I will first start by saying that I was appointed by Mayor de Blasio in late 2014, and I assumed my role as the chair and commissioner for the New York City Commission on Human Rights in 2015. And this is actually my first time ever in government. Aside from, I did a federal clerkship after I graduated from law school. But aside from that very brief stint, this is actually my first time in government. And for me, the lure into coming into government was really, taking both my professional experience as an employment lawyer at Alton & Golden, as Edward had mentioned, and taking the experience I had had working with different communities, and also taking my personal experiences as the daughter of immigrants from the Philippines, as the the wife of an Ethiopian immigrant. My wife is an immigrant from Ethiopia. Somebody who has a wife, meaning as a queer person of color, as a mother. I have 2 young children, but taking all of these different experiences and bringing that into government, into a space like New York City, where I know just from my prior experience being a practicing attorney that we had very strong protections in this area. Across the country, people oftentimes look at the New York City's human rights law as being one of the most powerful and protective human rights laws that we have in the country. But just knowing as a legal practitioner that, we hadn't really stretched the muscles of this law very much, that there was so much that could be done in New York City, given our legal protections, and frankly, given the will and the desire to respect human rights in New York City. So I was very much, attracted to the role because of doing that. Just to step a little bit back from all of that, I grew up in a small town in New Jersey. It was me and my sister and my parents. We grew up in a small blue-collar town in New Jersey where it was mostly Irish, Polish, and Italian Catholics. My parents are Catholics from the Philippines. And so, what did they do when they moved their family to a space? They found this place where there were a lot of other Catholics and, a lot of churches, as I think a lot of Filipino Americans did at that time. My parents were part of the stream of Asian immigrants that came into the United States in the late 60s. And my sister and I think grew up with a lot of the trappings of a wonderful middle-class upbringing in that area, but we also were very aware of how different we were from the people around us. People at that time really had not heard very much about the Philippines unless they were people who had been in the war and had been stationed at a military base in the Philippines, or unless through jobs at a hospital, they had met Filipinos that way as nurses or doctors, because those were kind of the common streams of immigration at that time from the Philippines. And so when we would meet people, people thought we were Puerto Rican, or they thought we were Black, or they thought that we were Chinese. And so we were constantly in a space of having to explain who we are. And I'm gonna leave it from that, but a lot stems, I think, for me and the human rights work that I do, and my my desire to create spaces where people feel welcome and comfortable, I think very much comes from my experience as a young person, always seeking that out, always really wanting that for myself and my family.
I can resonate with that, and I'm also from New Jersey, but we were.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we're from Jersey City, so it's a little bit different. Jersey City is one of the most diverse cities in New Jersey, so I think my experience was a little bit different. We grew up in a very diverse neighborhood, and just being exposed to that diversity was wonderful. Like, I loved it.
Well, Roni, what's interesting is my mother was a doctor for like 40 years in Bayonne, which is the town right next to Jersey City. Yep. And I've actually done this with Edward before, one of our mutual friends, but sometimes, my mom was a pediatrician. So, there's sometimes a shot that my mom was actually your pediatrician. I don't know, but,
it's funny you mentioned that, because your last name sounded very familiar to me.
Well, my mom might have been your pediatrician. One of our mutual friends, mine and Edward, she lives in Bayonne and grew up at the same time. And I said, "Did you know Dr. Malalis?" And my mom was actually her pediatrician. So
that's that is like usually when Filipinos would immigrate and they meet other Filipinos, they will.
Yep.
tend to, they'll say, okay, this is a good doctor, go to this, or go to this store, that's how you kind of build your network. But I think it's interesting too that you said just that the idea of identity and people not really knowing like what we are they know we look Asian, but what are we? Are we Filipino? Are we Puerto Rican? I've been mistaken for Puerto Rican. I've been mistaken for part Black. I mean, everything. And I think it's just interesting too, like what people are exposed to. Like you mentioned, you might not know Filipinos unless you were in the war, you were stationed in the Philippines. I find it's the same here in the US. I think people tend to think that if you're Asian, you're Chinese. And I used to think, well, why do they always think Asians are Chinese? And I thought, well, maybe in certain communities, the only Asians they see are like Asians that work in the Chinese restaurants in those communities. And that's all they're familiar with. So I think it's really interesting. And now with AAPI Heritage Month, there's so much education on the diversity just within the AAPI community.
Absolutely.
So much more out there. So
absolutely. And I think that this particular AAPI Heritage Month is, at least for me, very, very special. And I think that because in the last year we have seen different ways in which Asian American and Pacific Islander communities have been scapegoated and very much attacked in this past year, there's been so much more focus on recognizing the contributions of Asian American and Pacific Islanders, but also recognizing ways in which Asian American and Pacific Islanders have stood in solidarity with other movements for civil rights and human rights historically and now. And because there's been more of that, I think, talked about and happening in the last year, I have found that I've had more opportunities than I've had in the past to sit down with other Asian American women and reflect on the ways in which we've experienced different forms of othering or discrimination or harassment as children, and the ways in which it's followed into it's kind of evolved and morphed as we've gotten it to be adults. Because I think that there is a very distinct type of discrimination. It's like a combination of both race discrimination and misogyny that attaches to a lot of Asian American women as we become women. And there's been so much, I think, more reflection on that this year than there have been in past, because of the ways that we've seen Asian Americans, vilified during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just the image too of how Asians are, where we can be seen as passive, quiet, we keep our head down, we don't fight back. And I do feel like that has something to do with why we may be targeted more, especially with this pandemic. I mean, yes, it's just the whole idea that we're blamed for this, right, is one thing, but I think there's also the vulnerability of certain populations in the Asian community, like why the elderly are targeted and why we're generally targeted, because we're not seen as kind of fighting back. But I want to highlight one of the really interesting initiatives that the Commission has put forward, which I personally love. It's this public art campaign, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the I Still Believe
Sure.
initiative. Every time I see this, and for our viewers, you may have seen the artwork, it's all over the city. I feel like it started off the Barclay Center, it's in the subway stations, it's on trash cans, it's everywhere. And every time I see a poster, I smile, I get excited because it's representation. And there's such a powerful, such a powerful message. I printed out some and I'll just share them. I still believe in our city.
Yeah.
We belong here. I did not make you sick. This one is one of my favorite ones. This is our home too. This kind of reminds me of my Lola, grandma.
That's what I always say too. I look at that and I've shown it to my relatives and I'm like, this, my Lola who lived until 107. I always look at that and that's who I see.
Yeah, and the great thing, and I'll say before, is that it's also available in different languages, which I love.
Yes.
Like the fact
Yes.
that it's available in Tagalog, love it. So please,
Yes.
Carmelyn, tell us more about this.
So, I mentioned that we've seen, at my agency. So for folks that don't know, the New York City Commission on Human Rights, we are the city agency that addresses any form of discrimination or harassment that takes place in New York City. So basically, anywhere you live, breathe, work, exist in New York City, you are protected by what is oftentimes considered to be, as I said earlier, one of the nation's strongest, if not the nation's strongest, human rights protections. We have protections in employment, in housing, in places of public accommodation, kind of out on the street, in transit stations, everywhere, right? We are both civil legal enforcement agency, so people can file claims of discrimination and harassment with us. And if we find violations of our law, we can also award money damages, restorative relief, different types of compensatory relief. So there's a range of different things that we can award in those situations. We also do so much community outreach and education. So we have offices in each one of the 5 boroughs where we really try to go into communities and talk to different constituents. So business folks, houses of faith, schools, community centers, different industry groups. We really want to make sure everyone in New York City, one, understands what their rights are under our law. But we also, just as community, understand how we can create more equitable, more inclusive spaces to live, right? Because that's, I think, just the essence of New York City. We are diversity at its best, and we are best when we show solidarity for our different communities, right? So that is a lot of what we do. Part of that is also public education campaigns like the one that you just showed. So, for instance, when I first became the chair and commissioner at the agency in 2015, I came in at a time where across the country, we had seen something like over 20 anti-trans bills being introduced across the country. In 2015, the issue was creating fear about safety in single-sex facilities like bathrooms and locker rooms. That was where it was concentrated in 2015. I'm very sad to say that as we sit here today, there are again a slate of anti-trans bills being introduced around the country, especially in state legislatures, where what are they what are they targeting now? They're targeting people's access to healthcare, children's ability to participate in sports. So, kind of a very similar situation, but different topic areas. And while that was happening in 2015, we released a public education campaign celebrating the city's transgender and non-binary communities and people, but also providing awareness and education about the ability to file claims of discrimination and harassment with our agency, and also warn against doing things that would be discriminatory to folks. So similarly in that space, like we are always trying to, with our public education campaigns, we're always trying to hit issues that we know are relevant to New York City, but also carry national significance. I do feel that we have the responsibility in New York City, because we have good law and because for the most part there is public support for human rights. I do feel like we have the responsibility to speak on issues that also have national relevance, because we can do it, And so this past year has been very challenging for our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. At our agency alone, we have seen a 7-fold increase of reporting of anti-Asian bias claims. 7-fold. In 2019, I think there were a total of 25 to 30 claims in that nature filed at our agency. In 2020, this past year, we saw over 200, right? And if I just look at the numbers for 2021, we're just in the month of June, there's already 80 such claims that have been raised. So there are claims of people who are experiencing discrimination and harassment because they are Asian in employment or housing or trying to access public accommodations, meaning like just going to a grocery store. Early on in the pandemic, we saw that people didn't want Asian American people to enter their grocery stores because they were worried about contracting the virus. They were, we were seeing scapegoating in that sense too. Even earlier on, before New York City even became the epicenter of the pandemic, we saw the ways in which our AAPI businesses and business communities were being stigmatized and being affected, right? So people were saying, don't go into Chinatown, don't go into Flushing, don't go into Sunset Park. Those are highly dangerous areas. Again, scapegoating, right? And if you do human rights work for long enough, you know that this type of scapegoating, it's not new. We've seen this time and time again. It is the unfortunate case that in times of crisis and pandemic, people create even more fear by scapegoating certain communities. We've certainly seen it since we're in Pride Month. We've certainly seen it at the time of HIV/AIDS, right? Where our LGBTQIA communities were being scapegoated. And we've seen it in the past with Ebola, with our African communities. We've certainly seen it at other times with other times of medical crises with Asian communities. And the reality is it came back again here, where with COVID-19, we were seeing that happening with our AAPI communities, where people were scared to go out in public. They were scared they still are, sadly, scared to use transit stations, to go out in public transportation. And so again, we felt the need, we need to message both to our Asian American Pacific Island communities, we are here, your city is here to support you. We want you to report into us. We want you to reach out to us if you're in trouble, if you're in distress. At the same time, we wanted to message to people who would perpetrate discrimination, stop it. This city does not tolerate it. We reject that. Your city rejects that. And so we were very fortunate, the fates aligned, that this year we had an artist in residence by the name of Amanda Pingbadipakia, who is herself Asian American, who worked with us to create this campaign by speaking to people from a lot of our partner advocacy organizations across the city, who told her about, this is what I'm hearing, this is what people are saying to my face, this is how I'm feeling, this is what my children are telling me they're being told by other kids. And so using that information and drawing from her own personal experiences, she helped put together this public art campaign that again was meant to create visibility for our communities, to show that even in this past year, when it has been a time of fear and uncertainty for everyone, our Asian American Pacific Islanders here in New York City have had to deal with the additional burden of feeling scapegoated, of possible violence, of discrimination, and we have remained resilient. I have to tell you, Rona, what pride I have felt in putting this together, especially you and I are two examples of, during this time of crisis and pandemic, we are working for the city, with the city, right? Representing the city. And there were also obviously so many essential workers in hospitals and otherwise, Asian American Pacific Islanders, who were working so hard to combat the effects of this pandemic, and we're still living with this additional fear. We also really I really do hope people visit the page. I know we're providing links and some information on this, but visit the page because this was also meant as a campaign to stand in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. there's just no way around also acknowledging how finally, in the last year, as the protests swept the nation after, again, more murders of Black lives. We just commemorated the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder, right? That the movement for Black lives is, again, another iteration of our demand for human rights, of our demand to address racism, in that context to address anti-Black racism, but that we wanted to remind folks that movements against anti-Black racism and movements against anti-Asian racism have been in solidarity. They've been in solidarity from the early times when folks from both the African diaspora and the Asian diaspora came together to say, how are we going to deal with colonial powers? They've been together since the time of the 50s and the 60s with like Yuri Kochiyama being with Malcolm X, cradling Malcolm X's head when he was shot. They've been together historically for many of our country's bouts with anti-Black and anti-Asian racism. And we wanted to remind folks that we are here again, standing in solidarity, these two communities, to make sure that we are addressing both anti-Black and anti-Asian racism as they occur. So we wanted those dual messages to be out there. And we also wanted the tool. What I think is so important when a group is being scapegoated and stigmatized is that there needs to be public, visible shows of support for that community. Other communities need to say, I publicly denounce these acts of discrimination and racism. I visibly will show that I denounce this. So we created these posters so that businesses and individuals could print out these posters, so folks can go to the web links that I think we're providing, print out these posters, put them up in their windows, and be a public, visible reminder that here in New York City, we reject this. We reject the scapegoating. We reject the hateful messaging around COVID. We reject the discrimination that has been shown to Asian American and Pacific Islanders in their workplaces and in housing during this time. And I'm happy to say, like, as you were saying, we've been seeing the artwork everywhere. So where there are specific incidents of anti-Asian discrimination or racism or violence that happen, like for instance, a few weeks back, everyone I think remembers the footage of Vilma Kari, who is a Filipino woman who was attacked in broad daylight in like the Hell's Kitchen Times Square area. After that happened, we did a day of visibility there with people, fanning out in the Hell's Kitchen Times Square area, asking businesses and community members to put up these posters. And if you go in that area, there's several of those posters, again, just visible reminders that we reject this. So her artwork has been on Time Magazine. So I think it's not still on the cover, but it was on the cover of Time Magazine maybe 2 or 3 covers ago, on Lincoln Center. It's in Times Square. And it has caught on because the need for these public visible reminders has caught on. So it's now in Boston. There's things in other cities as well. And it has delighted me that it has started here in New York City.
It looks like it's going national and it's going global, which is great. And you mentioned Hell's Kitchen. I'm actually a Hell's Kitchen resident. So when that incident occurred and the woman was attacked in our neighborhood, and the fact that she was a Filipina woman, it really hit home for me, because I started thinking that could have been, my mother or my relative, and it could have happened to me walking outside. The fact that all of these attacks are happening in my own neighborhood, right? That's scary. And so it's really powerful to see this campaign everywhere and the visibility of it. And I think what I love most is the solidarity piece the fact that it's both dealing with the whole anti-Asian and anti-Black sentiments, and really reinforcing how both of our communities can work together. The fact that we're being attacked, we need to stand up for them, they need to stand up for us, right? Because that's what solidarity is. That's what we do.
And for that particular incident in Hell's Kitchen, I think that what was horrifying to people was not just how brutal the attack was, but what was also horrifying to people was there was also this image caught on video of someone closing the door, after it happened. And I think that especially in a place like New York City, it was horrifying because, again, we always want to believe, and we usually can, that people here will stick up for each other. That if we see someone being attacked in New York City, that they're not alone, that the bystanders will stand up for them, right? And so, I think an important part of the work that we've also been really amping up in the last year is providing more and more bystander intervention trainings with some of our community partners, like the Center for Anti-Violence Education or Hollaback or AAA-NY. New Yorkers are fantastic people, right? We all know that what makes New York City so special is the diversity of this place. We love that. We want to protect that. And frankly, people want tools at their disposal to do it. It's really hard when people witness something like that horrifying going on. People are oftentimes kind of, just frozen. They think to themselves, like, what do I do? What do I assist? And so by providing bystander intervention trainings, we are really trying to give people the actual tools so that they're building a little muscle memory. They're not frozen. If something like this happens, they know how to safely intervene while it's happening or directly after it's happening to help that person out. And, and this is across groups. One of the things that I love saying when I'm talking to a crowd of people in New York City is we are Asian, we are Black, we are Muslim, we are Jewish, we are so many things. This is the beauty of New York City, and we stand up for each other, right? We all want to know that if, God forbid, something were to happen to me when I was waiting for the subway or when I'm on the street, someone's going to help me. And in New York City, they usually do.
That's exactly what we need to stand up for each other. I think it'd be great to provide a link to some of the training, the bystander training and the other opportunities that you've mentioned.
Absolutely.
Link to that, to those resources. I want to also, going with the theme of solidarity, bring in, our solidarity with the LGBTQ community and how both the AAPI community and the LGBTQ community, we've gone through some of the similar challenges. And Edward, if you want to take over.
Yeah,
sure. Oh, go ahead, Edward.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in my past volunteering at LGBT clinics at the center, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, Carmelyn, is when people come in and they've been victims of hate crime or brutal discrimination, there is such vulnerability, there is such fear, there's such psychological, emotional, and mental destruction having gone through that. There's the sensitivity to that, and also the sensitivity within some parts of the community of ambivalence and fear of the police, of the history of that, and even just of reporting this. How then, within your commission offices throughout the city, is the staff sensitive to that, so that people are, there's that extra outreach and sensitivity, so that people feel it's a safe place and can feel that they can go there and be safe and defended and have advocates?
No, thanks for asking that, Edward. I think it's a great question. And it also goes to some shared experiences, I think, of looking at both API folks and LGBTQIA folks, right? So, one, I think that when you're working at an agency like mine, one of the greatest barriers is just getting people to trust the agency enough to report to the agency, for so many communities. So if I look at different Asian American or Pacific Islander communities, depending on who they are, depending on whether they're immigrants or when they, came here into this country, there's such a history of government as oppressor, right? So one, like for instance, there are a lot of Filipinos, since Rona and I are Filipino, I'll mention that, a lot of Filipinos who were fleeing a country mired in martial law coming into this country, right? For other Asian American populations, they were fleeing other types of oppressive government situations coming into this country. Then there's also the history of US sponsored oppression of Asian Americans, right? And we could look at just the first ever Immigration and Nationality Acts that restricted immigration into the United States, and they were focused on keeping Chinese people out. We could look at the history of anti-Asian sentiment also from the time of the Japanese internment, when basically we were looking at our own US citizens and saying, you're not welcome here, right? Then I could look more recently at the time of, post 9/11, when again, great fear among many Asian American communities, where they were in fact being surveilled by, different government entities post 9/11. So there's that, right? And, I'm going to say the same thing with our LGBTQIA folks, where again, history of over-policing in these spaces. Like, what was Stonewall? Stonewall was basically happening because police, there was the history of police, infiltrating our LGBTQIA safe spaces and trying to entrap people, arrest them, and again, criminalize folks just for being who they are, right? So very similar spaces. So given these very strong histories of government-sponsored oppression, why would you go to government? That's always the case, right? And I will say again, like, this is one of the reasons why it was so important for me to come into government. One, just representationally as a queer, Filipino American woman, to be like, this is my government too. This is a space I will occupy, because we need to make sure that government looks more like the people of New York City, including the people who have had a history of challenging, oftentimes violent interactions with government, to kind of reclaim the space of government, but also to signal to those communities, I care, I will care about your claims. We will listen to you, we will believe you, we will care about your claims, and you can look at me and hear me say this and know that you can believe me, not just because I'm saying it and it is true, but because I'm from your community, right? And that's why, at our agency, language accessibility has been incredibly important. When I first came into our agency, I think there were 9 languages spoken across my agency. I said, how can we possibly serve New York City with only 9 languages spoken across our agency? We now have over 30, right? Because again, if you think about it, when somebody is the victim of discrimination or harassment, it is probably one of the most traumatic personal experiences. And if you can remove any barriers whatsoever to people feeling uncomfortable talking about that, we've got to do that. And language is such an obvious one, right? Similarly, like, in the LGBTQIA space, I think having a more inclusive enforcement space or outreach space means, again, having representation within your ranks. Like, I love hearing reports back from, different queer communities where they say, I love that there's non-binary folks on your staff. I love that there's trans folks on your staff. I love that I see myself at your agency. I don't have to explain the the indignities of being dead named or being misgendered, because I'm actually talking to somebody who has experienced that as well in their life. So I think something that has been incredibly important is creating a very diverse workspace. And, you know, Edward, you'll remember that from our time on the LGBT rights committee at the city bar, it was very important for me also to be like, you know, if we're going to say we're an LGBT rights committee, we've really got to be an LGBT rights committee.
Exactly.
We need to have representation on the committee from those different areas of people who either identify in those spaces or who have had professional or personal experience working with these communities. And, you know, there's no place where that is even more important than in government, where it is our responsibility to serve these diverse communities.
I wanted to also share something with you in terms of, you mentioned Chinatown, with something that the club itself did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So Rona, as you know, chair of intercultural diversity, plans events for the club throughout the year. And February is always a great month in terms of celebrating the Lunar New Year and African American History Month. And she always crafts great events that usually are museum driven with all of what New York has to offer. And right before the pandemic, February 2019, Rona and I actually were planning events, and there was going to be the Lunar New Year celebration was going to be at the Museum of Chinese in America. And we were then going to have lunch afterwards, and she worked and planned this. And then all of a sudden, as you said, what was beginning to happen? Chinatown was becoming a ghost town. People weren't going to Chinese restaurants thinking that they were going to catch this virus. And we still kept this event going. And what was really interesting is we went to MoCA, which is the acronym for the museum, and they were doing a whole series on, you know, the centuries of discrimination against Asians in this country. And as we were walking through this ghost town of Chinatown, for people who are not from New York, who it is just such a vibrant, active community, the silence was deafening as we went into this great museum. And as we reviewed the history of the unfortunate history of the intolerance and discrimination in our country, it was surreal in that we felt that we were living it again, and that we were even saying to each other that what we're experiencing right now is going to be an exhibit in this museum in probably a year or two. And it was to be a New Yorker at that time and to show the support for Chinatown when a lot was turning away from that community, I think was a great thing that that Rona really pioneered and pursued.
That's wonderful. That I love that story. That's really, really wonderful, because that's exactly right. That's the time period. Even before New York City went into shelter in place, already we saw the effects on these business districts. You know, and I want to say that, you know, I think particularly when we're talking about Asian American Pacific Islanders, there's also part of what we have to combat. One of the barriers is this narrative of the model minority, right? That has in so many ways worked to the disadvantage of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And I mention that because, you know, between 2000 and 2016, 44% of Asian Americans in New York City entered poverty. 44%. That's between 2000 and 2016. And most of the people who accounted for account for that number were people who worked in industries like the nail salon industry, the restaurant industry, the food delivery jobs, right? And can you even fathom, folks, what that number is going to be when new reporting comes out? That was between 2000 and 2016. When we record the numbers for this time period, because what did I say? Nail salons, restaurants, and food delivery. I can't even fathom that number, what the number is going to be.
Indeed. Rona, I think you had a conclusion question you wanted to ask.
Oh, I just the model minority. Yeah,
we could stay with that. Go with it.
Just to
but
add
I know
to that.
I know you wanted to. There was something that you wanted to end with also. So go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, Carmelyn, you mentioned just the whole model minority myth, and I think in many ways it does negatively impact, because it's almost like our communities are invisible, that we don't need help when we in fact do, as you've pointed out, right? And then that's why I think for those reasons, when I hear just even terminology like it's the Black and brown communities, I try to expand that to just be like, well, can we just call it the BIPOC community, because we are all affected, and it's more inclusive term, but just the idea that we can't be invisible, we need the same assistance that other communities need, I think is a really it's a interesting point, and just the model minority myth, how that affects us. I can't believe it's almost an hour. I was hoping, maybe we can squeeze in another, I think, Edward, before we do the final question, do you want to jump into, I think you had another question. Dealing with the LGBTQ community, do you want to try to squeeze one of them in?
Yeah, no, I think Carmelyn really went through everything so thoroughly that I was going to bring up.
Can I say something regarding Pride Month related stuff? Is that okay?
Yes.
I've been saying, so I think we are at an interesting place in that. And I've been reflecting a lot. So my tenure as commissioner and chair of this agency is going to be ending soon. And it's interesting because I've been reflecting a lot on my time here and how things have, it's been a really interesting time to be doing the work of human rights, right? So for the majority of my time here, it has coincided with a federal administration that has been, for the most part, pretty hostile to human rights. And in many spaces, like human rights protections on the federal level had been, had contracted, or there have been attempts really to contract rights. And, that is nowhere, I think, more true than in the space of LGBTQIA rights, right? Where literally, in the last administration, there were efforts to erase us. Mentions of us were erased from federal agencies' websites and from reporting. There was the literal attempt to erase our community in different ways. And what is interesting is that, so first was 2015, where we were elated by marriage equality, right? I remember people rushed into my office and we were watching the reports of marriage equality becoming a reality, and just the happiness and relief, all the rights that are really, it was not just about marriage, it was all of the rights and obligations that come from being legally married. And then that was followed by this period of attempted erasure and so many attacks on LGBTQIA communities. And we are now in a period where we're coming out of this on the federal level, but on the state level, the attacks have been unrelenting. Like, I think, what was it, just last night in Florida, a new bill was signed saying that transgender girls could not compete in, student sports activities. But so we're now in this stage where there's like this sobering. We have on one hand a very positively, the court recognized that to discriminate against somebody in employment because of their sexual orientation or because they are transgender, that is discrimination that's covered under the federal statute. But at the same time, we have these attacks on the, on the state level. And I say this because at Pride, it's a time of great celebration, and I want us to be able to celebrate because there's so much that we should celebrate in our communities. And my God, we just came through, like I said, we just came through this horrendous time on the federal level. So we should celebrate. But I just want to also remind folks, we're still fighting for so much. We still have so much work to do. In New York City, we are incredibly fortunate that we have our law and that there are people in New York City who are very invested in enforcing that law, but that is not the same outside of New York City. That's not the same in many areas of New York State. It's not the same in many areas across the country. So while we are being celebratory for Pride, with the same vigor that we talk about being publicly supportive of our Asian American Pacific Islander communities, we have to continue to do that for our LGBTQIA communities, because there is a lot of undone or a lot of success that is still left for us to achieve in the future on this.
Yes.
So I had to say that because I've been so much reflect. Pride Month is an interesting month. We want to be celebratory, but we also know that there's still a lot of people from our communities and youth in our communities that are really suffering.
There's definitely done, and we want that. I think that's really the main reason why we are doing what we're doing, why we do these panels with NDNY and in co-sponsorship with the APA board, because there's so much work to be done. There's so much conversations that we need to have. And I kind of coined, at Notre Dame, we always cheer like we are ND. And last year I coined we are ND to mean we are not done, just to go with this, just the whole campaign and the efforts. Like, we're not done here, Notre Dame. We need to continue. If we truly,
that's great, yeah.
Our equity and our justice that we want and we need and we deserve for all of our diverse communities, we have to realize that we are not done, and we are never done. We'll never be done. So you mentioned that your tenure is coming to an end, and I don't know if you silently heard me say, "Oh no." That really saddens me to hear that, because I would hate to see somebody like you leave city government. I mean, you're such a strong leader. But I want to ask just our final question for the evening, which is, you've done so much work with transforming the commission and all of these wonderful initiatives that you've led. What do you see as your legacy, as you are approaching the end of your tenure?
I hope it is about, creating, as I said earlier, creating kind of a space where people saw themselves in government. So when I first came to my agency, I had my entire staff, Rona, coming from HPD, you're going to fall back on this, but my entire staff was 55 people.
Wow.
Yeah. And over the course of the last few years, we were able to bring it up to 160, right? So in some ways you look at that number and you're like, okay, there was almost like a tripling almost of the size of the agency. And that's very important, obviously. For the great majority of the people who joined my agency, the great majority of the people of those of that tripling, it was also their first time in government.
Okay.
So they saw it as an opportunity to say, we're creating space. We are grabbing our seat at the table. We are going to make government for the people. My hope is that is part of, the legacy of this time at the agency. I will also say, since we are, New York City, hello, you have a primary coming up, in just 20 days.
Yes.
And, you know, my agency, the history of my agency, I think really speaks to how important it is to vote and make yourself heard. The history of this agency is it used to be a much larger agency. When Mayor Giuliani first took office, my agency was over 330 people. By the time he left office, there were 33 people on staff, because that reflected what priority he gave to human rights in New York City. As we enter this, I have to say this as a civic service announcement, as we enter this time of voting in New York City, remember your votes really count. Just like we saw on the federal level, your votes will put somebody in a position where the agencies reflect the priorities of that person. That is also the case in New York City. So get out and vote.
Thank you so much, Carmelyn, for joining us this evening. A government for the people, that's what I heard, and I believe that's your legacy, and I love it. Thank you again, Edward. I don't know if you have final remarks, and then I'd like to invite Rachael to come back with our final remarks.
I just wanted to also thank GALA, which is the LGBT alumni group, for also co-sponsoring this event and promoting it. So thanks to them as well. And I'll hand this off now to Rachael.
Hi, everyone. Well, this was truly wonderful. The hour flew by. I would like to extend again, thank you to Commissioner Malalis for taking the time this evening to speak to us and answer our questions. I'd also like to extend our thanks to Rona and Edward for putting this event together. This is just for everyone who is still watching. If you are not already subscribed to our YouTube channel, we encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss anything. We also encourage you to follow us on our different social media channels. The links are in the description box. And also take a look at all the resources that were shared during this talk. They're all linked in the chat from throughout this evening. And so they are there for you to refer back to. And with that, I would like to thank—
Wait, Rachael, can I squeeze one? I have to squeeze one thing in, which is that if you experience discrimination or harassment in New York City, or you witness it, or see it in your community, neighborhood, etc., please report it. Call us at 212-416-0197. Report it online, www.nyc.gov/report discrimination. To say it.
Thank you. We can add that too, yeah.
Yes, and also one of your staff actually did share the link on how to get help, and that is one of the listed resources for this event. So definitely do encourage people that if you do experience that, to report it. You've been doing such a wonderful job in encouraging people and making them feel comfortable in doing so. So I hope people actually do take advantage of the fact that they can report. And yeah, so again, thank you all for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening.